Good evening and welcome, and thank you for coming. This is the eighth year that this program's been running, and I'd like to pay homage again to our patrons, Art for Art's sake, without whom this certainly could not happen. In times like this, we more than ever depend on patronage like this, and it's truly enlightened. I'd like to thank Kristen Poor and Patrick Heilman also, who organise the series and make it run so smoothly. The speakers this season will be Moyra tonight, TJ Wilcox, Charlene Heil, Liz Deshane, and Waleed Rad in early December. I've organised this, but after tonight, Dia's new curator, Yasmil Raymond, will take over, and I'd like you all to welcome Yasmil, who is somewhere here. I can't see her. It's a pleasure to introduce Moyra Davey. She is, I'm sure, very well known to most of you, but for those of you who don't know her biography, I'll give you a brief sketch. She received a BFA from Concordia University, Montreal, Quebec in 1982, and MFA from the University of California, San Diego in 1988, and she was on the Whitney program in 1989. Last year, she had a 20-year survey called Long Life, Cool White at Harvard University Art Museum. And she also recently spent a year in Paris on the International Arts Residency Program for the Cité des Arts. In addition, she's well known as a writer, and I think it's this particular combination of artist-writer that makes her, or makes the anticipation of tonight's talk so keen. She's published Mother Reader, Essential Writing on Motherhood in 2001, and also a really fascinating book called The Problem of Reading in 2003. Moyra was a founding member of Orchard, and she co-hosts with Jason Simon the 1 Minute Film and Video Festival in Narrowsburg in New York. I was very intrigued when I asked her to imagine whom she might speak about. I would never have guessed Louise Bourgeois, I have to say. For those of you who know the writing on Louise, you probably know that it's relatively constrained. Many people think that Louise is the best commentator on her own work, and certainly she's a compelling interpreter. There aren't many writers, in my opinion, or critics or art historians who've got outside this carefully defined boundary. I am assured that Moyra will be one of those few. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Lynn, for that very lovely introduction, and also thank you very much for this wonderful invitation to do an artist talk for Dia. It's really been a huge pleasure, and I'd also like to thank Kristen Poor for her support, and Patrick also for tonight, and all of you for coming to hear this talk. So thank you and welcome. All right. 9 August to see LB at Guggenheim with Julie. Some works are autonomous, mute, others attached to language. These always shock, pierce. Then on a park bench, sun, wrinkles, fat, and Julie telling me, do Louise Bourgeois. Okay, Patrick, I'll take the first one. Not until the winter do I make up my mind and begin to pore over the catalog for that show, practically a page-turner. And I read it twice, first on a trip back to New York in February, wrapped around it, flipping back and forth through its pages, wanting to be reading the whole book all at once. Let's see, did that work? Did a slide just change? Oh, okay, good. Then I read it a second time in Paris, more dutifully, cover to cover, but with the same anticipation and appetite, the same eagerness to finish one thing so that I can read the next. This book is a delectable object. I read it in an armchair, also curled around the book, but this time taking notes in a mauve notebook bought for the purpose. Writing sitting in an armchair is quite inefficient, and I'm amazed at some of the contortions I put my body through in order to write or take notes, practically lying down, a deliberate repudiation of the desk. I took notes from the book, and at some point my own diary notes began to filter in. March 21st. On one of the spleen days in Paris, I decided to start to write. I was at page 138 in Louise Bourgeois. From the notebook I copied. From LB, permission to scream, permission to intensely express opposite feelings, for instance, to someone I love, come to Paris, and then sadly don't come so that I can work. LB, art that saves. And I wrote from 2 postcards I have on my desk. Be calm, and art is a guarantee of sanity. During much of the time I was thinking and writing about Louise Bourgeois, I was in Paris. And since Paris is where she lived until she was 27, I decided to use my experience of the city to speculate about certain aspects of her life and work. In that most pleasurable aleatory fashion, I was given a reason to visit a museum, to seek out an object, to be someone on the trail of something. Roland Barthes, in his lecture series, The Desire of the Neutral, tells his auditors that all of his references and citations will come from the books contained in the library of his country house. The self-imposed limitation is in fact a freedom to construct one's work, one's world, with what is close at hand and close to the heart, with what is on the shelves, read, reread, unread, this last category perhaps awaiting just such a moment to be activated. These parameters allow for the crumpled book lying by the bedside, the one dropped from one's hands the night before, its last sentences mingled into dreams. And in my definition, these boundaries include the book from the extended library, the one brought home from the American Library in Paris by our partner for our son who will reject it. Barthes' model of the circumscribed library is the one I've adopted and, to be truthful, stretched a bit for my talk on Louise Bourgeois. I've always feared leaving behind my books, but I'm happy to say it doesn't matter. You can get by and thrive on the little you have brought, with what can be bought and borrowed, and perhaps especially with what chance drops in your lap. And so it was by chance that as I was preparing this talk on Louise Bourgeois, I picked up and read The Rejected Mildred Pierce, a story by James M. Cain set in the early 1930s in the Great Depression, and read it in late 2008 and early 2009, the season of another great panic over money. I read it in fits and starts because, contrary to what Tom Wolfe says in the introduction about not being able to put it down, I found Mildred Pierce a painful story to get through. I read several versions of this book as I was doing this. This is an old paperback version. March 27th, email to Jason. Dear Jay, unable to do much else this morning because of insomnia last night, I got back into bed with Mildred Pierce and finally finished it. It is one of the strangest books I've ever read, a bizarre combination of pulpy realism and high drama that perhaps equals opera. I was bodily and viscerally affected by Mildred's story to the point of trembling and tears. The interesting part of all this is a connection I want to make to Louise Bourgeois. I was feeling the impact of the novel emotively on 2 distinct levels. The first had to do with money. Mildred's desperation at the onset of the story is palpable. Her husband is left, she's broke, the mortgage is due, she has 2 children to support, and all she knows how to do is cook. So this is a still from the movie, which the movie actually diverges quite a bit from the book, but I've kept, I'm showing a few stills where the movie and the book story are consistent. Mildred answers classified. She registers with employment agencies. She pounds the pavement, desperately trying to find a job. Eventually, she must accept that she is only qualified to work as a maid or a waitress, position she never in her life imagined being forced to accept. The second and most intense level on which I experienced the book was the maternal. By a certain point in Kane's story, I began to recognize that it was entirely about the intensity and desperation of Mildred's maternal feelings. She takes the waitress job and works herself ragged, all the while concealing her employment from Vida, the snobbish, vengeful daughter of mythical proportions, idolized by Mildred and whose monstrous appetites she will do anything to appease. Her youngest child falls sick while Mildred is on a romantic tryst and tragically dies. And she eventually loses Vida as well and feels the loss brutally, as though a part of her own body had been cut off. Vida has become a celebrity opera singer whom Mildred, like a lover pining with romantic heartbreak, listens to at night on the radio, but has no other means of contact with. In an elaborate and expensive plan, Mildred succeeds in luring Vida back, but it costs her the cherished pie and restaurant business she has spent 10 years building. James M. Kane writes, Mildred now entered the days of her apotheosis. War was crashing in Europe, but she knew little of it and cared less, end quote. It is 1940, and she is 37 years old. Mildred wins back her child, but when she learns that Vida has stolen her husband, she destroys her, or so Mildred thinks. What, you may be wondering, does all this have to do with Louise Bourgeois? Here I paste in a fragment of Jason's response to my email. He said, take it as a given that all noir narratives will be the most original you've read because they are so extreme, so nightmarish, so born of the war and the Depression. Mildred's story takes place in America in the same decade that Louise Bourgeois moved from Paris to New York with the art historian Robert Goldwater and began a family, adopting a son and subsequently giving birth to 2 boys. This is a drawing from 1998, and the column on the right-hand side says, life starts when I meet Robert in June 1938, nothing before. And the rest of the piece is, it's very beautiful thoughts about looking at the son and seeing the father and looking for the father and finding him in the son. Mildred, born 4 years before Louise Bourgeois in 1907, even looks like Louise Bourgeois. And Louise looks a lot more like Mildred than Joan Crawford does in the movie. This is their wedding photograph taken in Paris in 1938. And this is Kane's description of Mildred from the novel. She was a shade under medium height, and her small size, mousy blonde hair, and watery blue eyes made her look considerably younger than she actually was, which was 28. About her face, there was no distinction whatsoever. She was what is described as nice-looking rather than pretty. And here's another photo taken just a couple of years later in Long Island in 1940. But I reiterate, where I made the strongest connection between the lives of the 2 women was on the affective level of motherhood. The rawness and violence of maternal feeling portrayed in the novel suddenly illuminated for me an aspect of Louise Bourgeois' life and work that, while never concealed, remained mediated by the artful fictions and abstractions she has spent a lifetime evolving. The last thing I had written in the mauve notebook just before the revelation about Mildred Pierce was Maman and the Taboo of the Devouring Mother, page 170. It is followed by a scrawl about Mildred, the mother who loved too much, and a note about asking my own mother not to come to Paris because I needed to work. Like an exquisite corpse or another surrealist trope, automatic writing, the sequences that turn up in a notebook can have a revelatory function. Reading the last pages of Mildred Pierce, I was bodily and affectively identifying with the extreme feelings of loss it dramatizes. The operatically scaled passions of Mildred Pierce, love, loss, fear, anxiety, hatred, destruction, and the many attempts at reparation are, of course, all prominent themes in Louise Bourgeois' oeuvre. This is an untitled drawing from 1943. It's ink on graph paper, and there are three little heads in the skirt, and perhaps those are the heads of Louise Bourgeois' three sons. Bourgeois writes, "In my work, there is a strong emotional motivation, but it is held in a kind of formal restraint. The motivation is emotional and murderous, or whatever you want to call it, but the form has to be absolutely strict and pure." Bourgeois' words, when she uses them, shock and pierce, but you are always aware that they are words, and even the most searing of them has a withholding, playful twist, such that the viewer is interpolated but never burdened, as with a confession. The mucus of feeling, to use Denis Ollier's term, is converted into something durable, beautiful, leached of sentimentality. Perhaps it is in this dispassion, this abstracting of experience through the cogent structures of writing, drawing, and sculpture that the mathematics and geometry invoked by Louise Bourgeois come to figure. This is one of the insomnia drawings from 1995. Bourgeois writes, "In the social world, everything goes wrong. In the physical world, something always goes wrong. In the world of geometry, it is safe. Geometry becomes a symbol of behavior." And that's from 1986. These are index cards that my son made for his study aids for his geometry class in Paris. One of the first things I was told when I arrived in Paris was that France is the land of geometry. And there the word geometry even gets used as a verb, as in géométriser un cauchemar, to geometrize a nightmare. The French language constructs a more formal, distanced subject. And even though Bourgeois is often writing in English, the matrices of her mother tongue and culture are imprinted on her speech. Well, actually, there's a detail of one of those cards. For instance, when asked in an interview about her etched series, He Disappeared into Complete Silence from 1947, that's what we're looking at here, a work I find utterly beguiling, Bourgeois responded that she does not write purple prose, and she uses the French words saccadé and syncopé, jerky and syncopated, to explain her style. I would describe Bourgeois' style as cut and dried. Terrible things might be happening, but there is always a slightly ironical distance taken on them. The fact of reading Mildred Pierce, an American pulp novel written in hard-boiled graphic style, brought back to me the real of Louise Bourgeois, the real of a child's flesh, the real of a mother's attachment and hurt, the real of cutting oneself off from people or being cut off by them, the real of aging bodies and ongoing loss. So this is one of 9 engravings that are part of this series. What I find really fascinating about them is, well, a few things. They often, have really kind of generic devices like once upon a time, but then there'll be really particular details like the eighth 8th Street subway at 6th Avenue. Also, what I find really interesting is that the drawings have very little to do with what's being described in the text, yet they seem utterly at home together. So I really find that endlessly fascinating, and I could just keep looking at this series over and over again. This is a painting called The Runaway from 1938, and you can see there's a swimmer in what is perhaps the ocean and a house that is perhaps an ancestral home or a family home in the background. But in the end, perhaps Louise Bourgeois is more Vida, Mildred Pierce's daughter, the artist, the coloratura soprano, desperate to break away from her conventional home, than Mildred, in the sense that she, Louise, is the daughter who leaves her family in the old world so that she can be freer in the new one. Bourgeois becomes a mother of 3 in the space of 2 years, but she is an artist mother, a proverbially ambivalent one. She is sometimes, quote, the monster from hell who tears her loved ones to shreds in her imagination, end quote, who might do away with her progeny in order to ensure her own psychic survival. She needs her time for her work. She cannot tolerate the presence of others in the house. At age 98, Louise Bourgeois still wants to be the daughter, not the mother figure many would claim her as. She has said on different occasions, I am still a girl trying to understand myself. I am really a woman child. I am not a mother, I'm a baby. I refuse to be your mother because I need a mother myself. And finally, we become sculptors because of our inability to grow up. Can you remember the Paris sky? Louise Bourgeois wrote this in 1947, 2 years after the war had ended. For the greater part of the time that I've been writing this talk, I've been in Paris, and no doubt this is why I'm led to think of Bourgeois during those years and the ones shortly after when she moved to New York, but remained psychically tied to her family in occupied France. Most of the people I encounter in Paris are too young to have lived through the war, but the themes of that recent history are being processed and are prominent in contemporary literature. Without fail, 1 or 2 books on the subject are reviewed every week in Le Monde and Libération. Only on occasion have I been struck by the Paris sky. Why? Because I spend too much time staring at a screen or a page, and I don't spend enough time simply looking at the sky or looking at the Seine, the river, as Marguerite Duras does in her film Aurelia Steiner from 1997, a voluptuous 30-minute tracking shot of water, bridges, piers, and sky that I was lucky to catch in the Elle exhibition at the Pompidou, a show of art by 200 women in the collection that, of course, also includes Louise Bourgeois. She is represented by the recent series titled Extreme Tension from 2007, which lists many body parts and also the pains, the cramps, the breathing, the palpitations, the smell of the hunted animal. So it's a series of drawings that kind of circled the room there. But back to the sky. Here is Virginia Woolf on the recumbent view from On Being Ill, one of the books I brought with me from New York. Referring to the fresh vision of convalescence, Woolf writes, perhaps for the first time for years, to look around, to look up, to look, for example, at the sky. And then there follows a 2-page elegiac description of clouds and sky. And Woolf concludes self-mockingly by saying, this then has been going on without our knowing it, ! Ought not someone to write to the Times? This is Cumul 1 from, I think, 1969, and it's cumul as in cumulus clouds. It's a title that Bourgeois uses for a number of works. A personal goal of the last year has been to find a way of working that mitigates the surges of adrenaline and anxiety brought on by deadlines and time crunches, a way of working that involves less stress and less of being consumed by the thing you are making or writing. It is arguable whether such a thing is possible. Duras, for instance, says, "There is no such thing as writing that leaves you the time to live. If you economize on writing in favor of life lived, you are not writing," end quote. And Bourgeois speaks of all the temptations I have resisted, all the fun I didn't have. Art is a sacrifice of life itself, end quote. Unless you completely shut the door on deadlines, they will not go away. But I wanted to see if it is possible to work in a way that is closer to the habits of daily life. In a video documentary, Slavoj Žižek makes a quip about the blank page. He says something like, "I take notes and then I edit the notes, and that way I am never actually writing." That's a paraphrase. What you have just heard and what follows are a series of notes written over a period of 6 months in Paris and in New York, born of some of the rituals of the quotidian, what Virginia Woolf, ambivalently referred to as non-being, meaning everything that went on in her life that was not writing. Louise Bourgeois does not explain her work. She weaves stories around it. Oblique and sometimes cryptic anecdotes are offered in place of answers. She has given herself permission to tell the truth a little differently each time, has built up a personal mythos around the past and her memories similar to Marguerite Duras's. Bourgeois' disclosures unfold a little like the Femme Maison paintings, each on close inspection revealing subtle and captivating twists on a theme. And I'll show those paintings and discuss them shortly. This is a detail of Cell 1 from 1991. April 23rd. Burrowing deeper and deeper into the past. Is it this city? Is it my age? And finding pockets of it illuminated as though by sudden flash. I am there. I am teleported back to moments 30 to 40 years ago, and it's not good. Louise Bourgeois says, "Blue is the color of the pensée plume," which I think means unconscious thoughts, at the waking up time, specifically for those thoughts that are not very pleasant, end quote. And in Télérama, which is kind of like a TV guide, French TV guide, Time Out kind of magazine, I read an interview with Pierre Boulez, who says, invoking Paul Claudel, "J'ai horreur du souvenir, j'ai horreur du passé," which I translate as, "I can't abide memory, I can't abide the past." Bourgeois writes, or says, I'm not sure, "I need my memories, they are my documents. To reminisce and wool gather is negative. You have to differentiate between memories. If you are going to them, you are wasting time. If they come to you, they are the seeds of sculpture." And in the middle, I guess you can see it says the first part of that sentence, "I need my memories, they are my documents." And this is the exterior of Cell 1. Yesterday, to visit Picpus Cemetery, were the guillotine bodies of 1,306 men and women aged between 14 and 90, victims of the 1794 terror, are buried in 2 common graves. The cemetery is tucked away behind a small church and a convent, surrounded by a stone wall and a garden, and is quite hidden from the street. It is one of the most lovely and tranquil places anywhere, but if you stop to imagine the bloodbath that took place in June and July of 1794 on the nearby Place du Trône, of children and mostly common people losing their lives in this most nightmarish way, it is horrific. Picpus is a place that invites contemplation. It is possible, in the serenity and beauty of the surroundings filled with bird sounds, to conjure up in a quite visceral way those dark days and nights. And this is the inside of Celle Choisie from 1990 to 93. There, I think of Louise Bourgeois' Celle Choisie with its menacing guillotine blade hanging over a small pink marble house the color of flesh. And I believe Bourgeois when she says it is not about French history, but about, quote, cutting with the past, with one's personal past. Sometimes it takes an instrument this dreadful to sever with that past. Do yoga while listening to Borges, who says, it's not healthy to think too much about the past unless it is to rejoice over it. If we write a book, it's to forget it. And Louise Bourgeois says, I became a workaholic to forget. And then asks, apropos of a given sculpture, does the tension go down? Is the compulsion eliminated? Is the pain gone? A successful sculpture is one that allows her to be free of a specific regret, a painful memory. She wants to put to rest memory and conflict in the same way that Borges wants to forget what's in the books he's written. I described Louise Bourgeois' little pink marble house with the guillotine blade to my friend Alison Strayer, who brought me to Picpus. She wondered about the possibility of Bourgeois ever having seen the miniature Bastille fortresses carved out of actual stones of the demolished Bastille by an entrepreneur named Pierre-François Pallois. Pallois sold these carvings to municipalities all over France, more or less extorting the money from its mayors, lest they be thought unrevolutionary. I went to the Carnavalet Museum looking for the miniature Bastille and found several. A stove. This is a tiny seal for wax seals. This is a cardboard Bastille with glitter on it. It's very old. This one I don't have any information about it, but this is the actual Pallois Bastille. The Pallois Bastille is almost the same size as Choisie. I also found toy guillotines carved out of ivory. While I have no way of knowing for sure, it is nonetheless tempting to imagine that Louise Bourgeois might have seen these carvings in her youth and retained some trace of them in her friend, the unconscious. Here's one of the guillotines. Oops. I'm gonna have to do something here. So, Femme Maison, woman house. Bourgeois' terse, fearsome language about severing with the past, about cutting with her family, about insisting on her right to an autonomous work life, reminds me of Virginia Woolf's from her essay Professions for Women, in which she describes the Victorian figure of the angel in the house and her determination to eliminate her. Woolf delivered this talk to a group of women in London in 1931, when Mildred Pierce was 28, Louise Bourgeois was 20, and Marguerite Duras was 17 years old. And this is the Bourgeois family in front of that house in Choisie, the same house that's reproduced in the little carving. And just to the left of center is Josephine Bourgeois with Louise sitting on her lap. Here is Virginia Woolf's description of the angel. She was intensely sympathetic. She was immensely charming. She was utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She sacrificed daily. If there was a chicken, she took the leg. If there was a draft, she sat in it. Above all, she was pure. Yeah, it's pretty hilarious. And then Woolf goes on to say, it was she who used to come between me and my paper when I was writing reviews. It was she who bothered me and wasted my time and so tormented me that at last I killed her. I turned upon her and caught her by the throat. I did my best to kill her. My excuse, if I were to be had up in a court of law, would be that I acted in self-defense. Had I not killed her, she would have killed me. Woolf's trenchant words reverberate in Louise Bourgeois' language, in her articulation of fierce and murderous feelings directed first at her father and later at her own family, her children. Bourgeois says, "I am violent, I destroy my friendships, my love, my children." And also, "Watch out, it is a grand mal day." Bourgeois is surrounded by boys and men. This is a photograph of her in Connecticut with her 3 sons in 1945, and Robert Goldwater is just to the right. The house represents family convention, the woman's place. The house is Choisy, where Bourgeois' mother was the model of discretion and wifely duty. And it is the house in New York where Bourgeois, an artist with 3 children, worked for 30 years, not showing or selling, and consequently needed to be always finding space for her sculptures, finding places in the house in which to squirrel them away because they do not sell. Here is a description of what Jerry Gorovoy found when he visited her Chelsea brownstone in the late 1970s. And this is Bourgeois in that brownstone. He found, quote, "the multitudinous residue of a fitful 4-decade-long career crammed into every available inch of the sub-basement, basement, upstairs closets, corridors, corners, and shelves of this urban lair." But now it is different, and Louise Bourgeois tells us, Robert Miller sells everything. The studio is nearly empty. And for Bourgeois, quote, "it is a great, great pleasure for me to see again the place ready to be used." In La Vie Matérielle by Marguerite Duras, titled Practicalities in English, another of the books I brought with me to Paris, there is a chapter titled La Maison, the house, in which Duras describes a feeling similar to Bourgeois', the release and pleasure of the tabula rasa. Duras writes, "For 15 years, I threw my manuscripts away as soon as the books came out. If I ask myself why, I think it was to wipe out the crime, to make it seem less important in my own eyes. It was so that I could pass better in my own circle, to tone down the indecency of writing if you were a woman about 40 years ago. It was total destruction. I can remember the days that followed the burnings. Everything became neat and virginal again. The house seemed lighter, the tables were free again, smooth and empty and without a trace." The house is a prominent theme throughout Mildred Pierce. Here's another still from the movie. It is the modern American house whose bathroom is a utile jewel. I love that. It is the dump despised by snobbish Vita. It is the house that, quote, "crushes Mildred beneath interest, taxes, and upkeep," end quote. And like Choisy was to the mercantile bourgeois family, it is the site of small industry, of Mildred's business. And this was the sign that she put above her first restaurant. It is the site of small industry of Mildred's business, which eventually expands into 3 more homes. And this is the first home. It was an actual residence that where she opened her first restaurant. Okay. The first time I looked at these paintings, this is the first of 4 Femme Maison paintings, Woman House, from 1946-47. The first time I looked at these paintings in a book, I was struck by their formal eloquence and the inventive ways each one rehearses variation on a theme. My eye moving back and forth from painting to painting, taking in all the playful additions, subtractions, and repetitions. Each painting strange and different. The paintings have obvious surrealist associations. Here is Louise Bourgeois' typically circular, contradictory, and consistent with dream logic comment about the Femme Maison paintings. She says, She, meaning the woman, does not know that she is half naked, and she does not know that she is trying to hide. That is to say, she is totally self-defeating because she shows herself at the very moment that she thinks she's hiding. The paintings now look like the classic dream situation of being naked or nearly naked in public and trying to hide. They remind me of a dream, we've all had them, about running from mailbox to mailbox, trying to conceal the fact of nakedness. But it never works. Some part of the sexual region is always, even if just barely showing. All of the buildings look very American: skyscraper or brownstone, clapboard New England, barn, plantation Greek revival. But what to make of the woman in these paintings? She is exposed, vulnerable, headless. She is perhaps even a bit comical. The paintings are edgy and they produce discomfort, even a feeling of danger and entrapment. The woman depicted suggests alternately femme fatale. I'm just going to go through them one more time. Porcelain doll, surrealist muse, and Greek goddess. However, this woman is definitely not the, quote, bitter, disagreeable housewife derided by Simone de Beauvoir in her chapter on the married woman in the second sex, published in 1949, just after the paintings were produced. She is not Eugénie Grandet, and this is from another one of my little trips in Paris to the Maison Balzac. She is not Eugénie Grandet, the character from a Balzac novel whom Bourgeois has described as impossibility to go out. This woman is and is not the house. She is inside and outside, caught, but also, with the exception of the falling woman house, strangely autonomous and self-possessed. I expect this woman house must represent a good deal of the ambivalence of a woman who is a mother and an artist and whose house is home and studio all at once. And this is Louise Bourgeois on the roof of her building in 1944 with sculptures or sculptures in progress behind her. She apparently used the roof of her building as a studio at that time. May 25th. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I start thinking about a scene from a documentary in which Pierre Bourdieu is telling a graduate student, whom I expect may be taking too long to finish his dissertation, that any breaks, a week, a weekend for a conference, even the break of a night's sleep, disrupt the flow of writing. I remind myself of why I'm doing this: to make something, to learn something, but not to become an expert on Louise Bourgeois. And these are all quotes from Bourgeois. Sleep will restore you. Art waits on life. I love this one. And the unconscious better be your friend. And Duras has said about writing, quote, "It's a matter of deciphering something already there, something you've already done in the sleep of your life, in its organic ruminations unbeknown to you." And that's from her book, Écrire, which means to write. So these are works in progress from around 1945 called personnages, meaning people, personages, figures. And all of these works, here are some of the finished works in a gallery in 1950. All of these sculptures were meant to be stand-ins for people in Bourgeois' life, her family, friends who were in France in the 40s during the war. The French art historian Elisabeth Lebovici wrote about Bourgeois' move to New York in 1938, quote, "Then, having put an ocean between herself and France, family, and yesterday, they could become the locus and terrain of homesickness." I thought of Marguerite Duras in connection to Bourgeois, another French woman born 3 years later than Bourgeois in 1914, whose oeuvre is also underpinned by an elaborate mythos of phantoms, real and imagined, who return in different guises in the books and films. Both artist and writer have devoted major parts of their work to expiating these demons. While Louise Bourgeois was in New York, relieved to have escaped the old world patriarchal strictures, but also guilt-ridden and fearful for the safety of her family in war-torn Europe. Duras was in the thick of it, living the horrors and conflicts of the French occupation. Some uncomfortable ambiguities are part of the record. Duras worked as a secretary for the Vichy Paper Allocation Office, and she was intimate with a known collaborator. In 1943, she became active in the resistance. Both Bourgeois and Duras are women surrounded by men. Louise Bourgeois by her husband and 3 boys, Duras by brothers, a husband, and many lovers, eventually a son. There is this historical wartime connection. One woman remains in Paris, makes difficult choices, and is haunted by them. Duras invents a Jewish character, Lolvi Stein, as a way to talk about some of this history. She writes Hiroshima, Mon Amour, about a 20-year-old woman who sleeps with a German soldier and is punished for it. Duras has said we are all responsible for Nazism. Bourgeois luckily escaped the immediacy of war. She did not have to make the same choices, but surely she was haunted by what she did not and could not do. In 1945, Bourgeois curated the show Documents France 1940 to 44, and she said, quote, "I must have felt guilty to have abandoned my family in France. It's as simple as that," end quote. Furthermore, one could argue that all of Bourgeois' work is about working through these traumas, making reparations for sins and omissions real and imagined. So this is the announcement for the show that included newspapers, resistance newspapers and tracts, art, poetry, prose. And this was held at the Norlis Gallery in June of 1945. When I began to think of the connections between Louise Bourgeois and Marguerite Duras, it was around this idea of presence-absence during the war, but also very much around the theme of the house. The house is a recurring motif for Bourgeois. There's this is a piece called Maison Fragile, Fragile Houses from 1978. These are 2 Femme Maison carvings from 83 and 94. And this is titled House from 1984. And as I mentioned, it is a chapter in Duras's La Vie Matérielle, a book I've owned for a long time, though until now, I'd never read it cover to cover. Mostly I'd read this one chapter over and over, and many of its images had stuck with me. Though upon reading it again more closely with this talk in mind, I realized that my understanding of it, no doubt due to the fact that I was reading it in French, was imperfect. I'd attributed to Duras a more consistently combative feminist stance than is present in this chapter. In fact, like her wartime behavior, this chapter embodies many of Duras's contradictions, from her sometimes grating prescriptions about motherhood, femininity, and maleness, to her powerfully radical utopian Marxist feminism. She writes, for instance, "A house means a family house, a place especially meant for putting children and men so as to restrict their waywardness and distract them from the longing for adventure and escape they've had since time began," end quote. Simone de Beauvoir gives voice to similar thoughts in The Second Sex. It is something to the effect of, "That is the simple truth, like it or not." But for Duras, the house is also her mother's house in Indochina. It's her farmhouse with a long memory of other women's lives. It's the ship she takes enormous pleasure in piloting. It is the empty house of solitude in which to write. Duras says, I recall the kind of silence there was after they went out. To enter that silence was like entering the sea. This is an untitled pen and ink drawing from 1951. Duras states that her house in Neaufle-le-Château is the one that stood in 1789 and 1870, and, quote, whose surfaces had been rubbed smooth by 9 generations of women. It is the house that consoled her for all her childhood pain, the house she cared for and cleaned. That was a quote. Less so after she'd begun her books. It is the house she gave to her son and in which she preserved everything of hers. And this is called Maison Vide, Empty House, and it's a house that Bourgeois bought on Staten Island and gave to her son Michel, but in which he never lived, and she kept it empty, gave it this title, Maison Vide, from actually I'm not sure what the date is. Duras writes, lots of women never solve the problem of disorder, of being overrun by the chaos families produce. They don't realize that disorder, or in other words, the accumulation of possessions, can only be dealt with in a way that's extremely painful, namely by parting with them, end quote. And Bourgeois says, the poets, and then in parentheses Baudelaire, know and talk about chaos. If you know it, you can manage it. But you have to be shrewd and smile. And I think what she's referring to here is just the insanity of Baudelaire's life and the fact that he still managed to write what he wrote. Let me see, what is the next one here? That's a photograph of Baudelaire's grave. About all the different diaries Bourgeois keeps, recorded, drawn, and written, she says, having these various diaries means that I keep my house in order. And this is another one of the insomnia drawings from 1995. Summer 2009, New York City. Reading Louise Bourgeois for the 3rd time, holed up all weekend, making a big push. Reading Bourgeois, Lebovici, de Beauvoir, Duras, Borges, intense immersion into other lives. I've indulged in a months-long imbibing of Bourgeois and Duras. James M. Cain's Mildred Pierce was a catalyzing element, and Mildred has stayed with me. Now I'm having trouble finishing because of my doubts about including too much on Duras in a talk about Louise Bourgeois. Part of me wants to take back the equivocation I expressed about Duras's feminism. I've gotten to know her a lot better in the last 6 months. Maybe her opinions are generational with some French pride thrown in. And now that I think of it, Bourgeois' feminism, is she or isn't she? The title and subject of Elizabeth Lebovici's essay in the Francis Morris catalog has been a long-standing speculation as well. I know there are strong links between the two women, between Duras and Bourgeois. Both privilege the workings of the unconscious. Duras says, writing is the attempt to know what one would write if one were to write, which is so close to what Gary Winogrand says about photography. I photograph to see what something will look like photographed. And then she goes on to say, we only know it afterwards. And also, I will never know why one writes, nor how one cannot write. So that was Duras. Bourgeois introduces her album by writing of, quote, artists who work for a reason that nobody can quite grasp, end quote. And towards the end, she says, after a work is finished, then you say, ah, my God, this is what I meant, end quote. Both Duras and Bourgeois have doggedly excavated their dark sides and traumas. In book after book, Duras unflinchingly recounts her cruelties and the cruelty done to her. beatings, the shame of poverty, the degradations of colonialism. For Bourgeois, it is the early marking by and ongoing shame of paternal rejection and humiliation. Both artist and writer have spent a lifetime revealing themselves, yet both remain profoundly mysterious and in many ways unknowable. No doubt this ability to keep some part of the self always secret is a quality of exceptional artists. Using Melanie Klein's model of infantile psychic development, Bourgeois' art practice has been characterized by an oscillation between a schizoid paranoid position of anger and lashing out and a depressive reparative one of trying to make whole again. And this is from Mignon Nixon's book, Fantastic Reality. With Duras, there have been movements toward reparation, notably around events of the war. More striking is Duras' refusal to pass moral judgment or to have her own morality judged. I'm going to conclude with a few more words and images from Duras and Bourgeois and from Kane's Mildred Pierce. This is Cell 7 from 1998. In her apartment on the Rue Saint-Benoît, the one she'd occupied since 1942, almost as long as Bourgeois has occupied her Chelsea brownstone, Duras describes being alone one night and deciding to sort through some clothes. She removes a drawer from a Louis XV chest and discovers an article of clothing. Here is her description. It was a slightly yellowish white, but bright, crumpled like a screwed-up piece of paper, and flecked with pale pink stains. It was a caraco, a woman's loose underblouse. 1720, I said aloud. The pink marks were like those made by the light-colored blood of the last days of menstruation. It had got caught and dragged by the drawer above until it disappeared down the back of the commode, and there it stayed for 200 years. It was covered with months and months of darns, with darns which had been darned themselves, as beautiful as embroidery. The first thing you think when you realize what it is she must have hunted for it all over the place for days and nights, end quote. Bourgeois has made many works with her own clothes and undergarments, signposts in the search for the past, she calls them. This is Pink Days and Blue Days from 1997. I don't know if there are bloodstains on any of the garments, but some appeared to be dyed pink, and most have a worn, abject quality, retaining traces and shapes of the body. Of the color pink, Louise Bourgeois has said, it is feminine. It represents a liking and acceptance of the self. But upon rereading and copying Duras' passage on the caraco, it is the description of, quote, the darns which had been darned themselves, as beautiful as embroidery, end quote, that strikes me for its evocation of Louise Bourgeois' history as a daughter of tapestry restorers and of her many works embodying an ethos of destruction, repair, and reparation. The novel Mildred Pierce ends with Mildred losing everything, back with her first husband, Bert, in the original Pierce home, Vida having thrown the final punch. To a sobbing Mildred, Bert says, to hell with her, to hell with Vida. Kane writes, through the tears, the woe, Mildred seemed to sense what he meant, what it cost her to swallow back her sobs, look at him, squint, and draw the knife across an umbilical cord God only knows, but she did it. Okay, Bert, to hell with her. End quote. And then, almost with gusto, Mildred says, let's get stinko. So Mildred is actually, even though she's lost everything, she's repairing her own life and her relationship with her first husband. And this piece is Femme Couteau, Woman Knife, from 1982. And this is self-portrait as Saint Sebastian. Duras writes of giving up her library. She no longer keeps books, but two, The Witch by Jules Michelet and A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, accounts of women in extremis, define her life. Duras has no trouble imagining herself in Europe's medieval forests or enslaved in the factories of 19th century England. And this is an untitled painting from 46, 47. And there's also three little heads, either emerging or going down the chimney, I'm not sure. I've had a yellow Post-it note on my laptop for weeks, months even, with this unambiguously feminist declaration by Duras. She wrote, "Through the centuries, I see woman in a limit situation, untenable, dancing on a thread above death," end quote, but had not found a way to include it. And now I'm pasting it in final place, giving it extra, maybe even undue weight. This is Altered States from 1992. Nonetheless, I will end my talk by saying that despite Bourgeois' prodigious and multifaceted practice, despite her refusal to be pinned down, she has said, "I'm a woman, so I don't need to be a feminist." This is Woman Giving Birth from 1941. Despite Louise Bourgeois' shunning of didacticism and pontification and her professed love of the concrete, Duras' stark assessment of a woman's historical situation is singularly and uncompromisingly present in Louise Bourgeois' 7 decades-long corpus of work. Thank you. Sure, yeah, thank you. Well, I'll just say something actually in response to your comment at first, Lynn, about you were really surprised when I picked Louise Bourgeois. And it's so interesting to me because several of my friends who are really close to me, who've known me for a long time, and who also are very familiar with Bourgeois' work, said exactly the same thing, that they were really surprised. And in fact, one friend said when I was deliberating about which artist I should pick, she said, "I think you should do Bourgeois because I really want to know what you think about her." And I found that so surprising because to me it seems really obvious what the connections are, but not necessarily to others. Greg.
I was wondering if you could talk more about the centrality of writing as the point around which all of these artists, particularly the point around which you make Bourgeois evolve. Because I've been thinking about it a lot, say, in relation to Duchamp, who Paz says he got all this stuff from
Right.
General idea, it was really, they got everything from Moyra. And I'm wondering if something can be said more, or amplify more, or talk about anything about how what it means now, today, to talk about the centrality of writing in relationship to making art.
I mean, in terms of what I read about Bourgeois and her connection to literature, Pascal is mentioned. I have to say, quite honestly, I don't know too much about what her literary tastes and interests are, except that I've read that literature is important to her, and yeah, I'd be very curious to see her library, but. In terms of, the centrality of writing, I mean, I guess the easiest way for me is to just sort of address it via my own, my own experience. And I mean, I was thinking about this talk and how it all kind of came together around books, and it was. It's really, it's really curious to me, actually, just how unconscious that development was in this talk. I didn't plan it. It was, it really was this kind of this sort of configuration of Mildred Pierce. I had brought the Duras book with me from New York. I guess I didn't know then that I was gonna do this talk, and but I had some kind of intuition, I think, about that book, and that it was important to bring it. What else was I going to say? So it's, I mean, for me, it's all fairly, unconscious and kind of coincidental, things that I sort of, but I gravitate towards that as well. Does that, I don't know, doesn't really answer your question. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
I thought it was an interesting choice of Louise Bourgeois because I think Louise is not a truly overtly intellectual artist, but more of an emotional artist.
Mm-hmm.
The work really just goes straight to the nervous system, and then you sort of kind of come to the intellectual part of it kind of on the backside.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a way, it's nice to hear your take on it coming from another direction.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think I think it's true that she doesn't. I think she's wary of theorizing of her work, and although I gather she was I gather she was happy with Mignon Nixon's interpretations, very psychoanalytic interpretations of her work. It seemed like they had a kind of partnership, a working relationship in developing that book. It's called Fantastic Reality, and but yeah, no, I think that's one of the things that that really interests me about Bourgeois also, that it's not her, she doesn't over intellectualize or theorize her own work, that it's it's very much about kind of unconscious material and responses. Yes?
I was wondering, as someone who you're working with photography more, and she's working with, well, you gravitate towards her drawing, and a little bit of culture, do you find room for expression in your photography, and trying to complement that, or do you ever do draw?
Do I ever? No, I haven't drawn for a really long time, and but I think maybe probably one of the reasons why I gravitated towards the drawings, the flat work, the two-dimensional work, is that in fact I was preparing this talk with books pretty much, and I have seen Bourgeois' work, but the cells, for instance, they're really complex, and I think it's really hard to hold them in your imagination. You really have to spend a lot of time with them and experience them. And I was spending more time with books, and so. No, I think the cells are, they're. I have really strong memories of some of the cells. And what was your question about photography?
I guess I was thinking with both Louise's texts and her drawings are much more, there's more freedom for expression, and with photography it feels more limited, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
If you wrote sort of to complement that.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's true that I did start to kind of make writing part of my work as a way to, I guess, deal with what I found were the limitations of photography for me. Yeah. Yes.
My second question about feminism, because I feel like something that I really loved about your talk was the way in which I think you made clear that taking a position as a woman artist, as a feminist, at different moments resonates differently. And it seems to have a lot to do with thinking about how work of various kinds can be thought of in terms of reparation. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about feminism and reparation in terms of, I mean, this kind of question about whether Louise Bourgeois is a feminist or not is really an interesting one in relationship to her own sort of position historically and in contemporary art now. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that relationship. Does it matter if she's a feminist?
I personally don't think so. I don't think it matters that she doesn't. It's sort of against her nature and her style to kind of come out and declare herself as any one thing, I think. And I think that Duras is similar, actually. Duras really doesn't want to be pinned down and, has said all kinds of, contradictory things about her past and so it's it's interesting. I think that it seems to me that like both of them, both Duras and Bourgeois, are kind of like anti-ideology in a way. Like they don't want to be framed by any kind of sort of ideological naming, something like that. That's my guess. Yeah. Yes?
I'd like to know where she drew her artistic inspiration for influences from. Where did she learn her craft?
Louise Bourgeois, she went to art school in Paris. She frequented a lot of different studios in Paris in the 30s. So it was, it was a pretty traditional kind of art, education. I don't know. Maybe there's like some art historians here who have. I mean, I know she was kind of on the. She was kind of on the peripheries of the surrealists at Breton and Duchamp and people like that. But when she came to New York, she was very ambivalent about them because they were her friends, but they hadn't really accepted her, in the beginning, and also just that they kind of represented these father figures to her that. She was, I think that she found pretty distasteful. But, definitely the surrealists, that group of surrealists were an influence, even though I read something she said, she denied vehemently being a surrealist. This was a lot later, and said that she was what is Sartre? He's an existentialist, that she was an existentialist. So there's a bit of ideology there, or framing. Yes? She says who? Uh-huh. Is this in the book? Louise Bourgeois says Jean Moreau is the only man. Whoa. I really don't know. I think I need to know a bit more about the context in which he said it to speculate. Mm-hmm. What do you think it means? No. Well. Okay, thank you.